Jim Rosapepe, who was the ambassador of the United States to Romania from 1998 to 2001. Jim?
Thank you very much. And thanks to everyone to coming out this evening. These programs are always stimulating. But I'm particularly pleased to be here tonight with my friend, Ambassador Chris Hill. Now, sometimes people say that somehow American foreign policy only knows one country or one region, and has got a little obsessed in recent years in one area. And I think the work that Ambassador Hill has done over the last several years is an absolute demonstration that is not the case, that the United States government has the capability and skilled diplomats have the ability to focus on the broad range of issues that are important for our future and for the world's future. As you know, he's Assistant Secretary for Asia, for East Asia. And East Asia includes China, where people tell us today that's the reason we have high oil prices. People tell us that's the reason we should be concerned about global warming. And everyone in the world will be focused on China as the Olympics come about this summer. But obviously it includes the growing economies of Korea and Japan and Vietnam and the others. That's his part of the world. One specific part of the world where he has played a particular role and is playing a particular role is North Korea, the one member of the axis of evil that we actually do know had weapons of mass destruction. And he has been working very aggressively and effectively the last few years to deal with that problem, and he will talk about it in detail today. These are very important issues for our country and, frankly, for the world. He started out his career in international relations as a Peace Corps volunteer in Cameroon. He's a career Foreign Service officer, served obviously around the world in many posts. He's been ambassador to 3 countries: Macedonia, Poland, and South Korea. In addition to being Assistant Secretary today, he is the head of the U.S. delegation in the 6-party talks dealing with North Korea and dealing with their weapons of mass destruction. On a personal note, I got to know Ambassador Hill as a colleague and as a boss. When I was ambassador to Romania, during the first 9 months I was ambassador, he was ambassador to Macedonia during the NATO action lead up and the action in Kosovo. He then was in effect my boss as special assistant to the president and the director for the National Security Council of Southeast Asian Affairs, and then went on to be ambassador to Poland. He has a favorite expression that I've always loved, and I shamelessly steal, and sometimes I attribute it to him and sometimes I don't, that as you deal with leaders around the world, and probably frankly in our own country as well, though he doesn't say that as a diplomat, nobody is as good as they seem or as bad as they seem. There's a lot of wisdom in that. But Ambassador Hill breaks the mold. He is as good as he seems. Ambassador Hill.
Thank you very much, Jim, for that very nice introduction, which I wish were partly deserved. But anyway, it's great to see you here. It kind of brings me back to happier days when I was in Poland and in Warsaw, and you were in Bucharest, and we'd get together. I remember the ambassadors would get together every few months, and we'd talk about the problems of the region. They're kind of nice problems, how the region was going to be integrated into the European Union, et cetera. And, no one, not even Slobodan Milosevic was interested in nuclear weapons. And so it was indeed. When I look back at those days, I think, Milosevic was kind of sort of a Boy Scout compared to what we've been dealing with since that time. So anyway, it's great to see you and great to see all of you here. It's great to be here in Baltimore and to hear, of course, that Catholic Relief is one of your sponsors, because I worked a lot with Catholic Relief when I was in Macedonia, because we had this situation in 1999, a century ago, where we had these refugees from Kosovo who were flooding into Macedonia. The Macedonian government didn't know what to do with them, and so the American Embassy encouraged the Macedonian government to set up refugee camps, and we were able to So they set up these camps, and the question was, who was going to run these things? And Catholic Relief Service came and ran them. And I remember it was in my house. We had the Deputy Secretary of State, Strobe Talbot, come, and he met with the Macedonian Prime Minister, who very reluctantly agreed to set up these camps. So that was a Saturday night. And I think Sunday morning we went and told the NATO general that we would if NATO could pop some tents, we could that the Macedonian government was going to allow this place to be a refugee camp. So that Sunday afternoon, which happened to be Easter, we had something like, I think, 140 refugees who came down from Blotse, which is the border on Kosovo and Macedonia. And by Monday, we had something like 1,000 refugees. By Monday night, we had 15,000. And by Thursday, we had 65,000. So it was called Stenkovac's refugee camp. I know. There were several sections to it. It was a big job, and Catholic Relief Service out of Baltimore was there and really took charge of that very, very tough time. Because the trouble with the whole bombing operation against Serbia is we were bombing Serbia in order to change Milosevic's mind about allowing NATO into Kosovo, NATO forces to sort of calm things down in Kosovo, get the Serb military out. And so when you're bombing to change someone's mind, you got to wonder sort of how do you change his mind? I mean, if you bomb a bridge, would you change his mind because he likes bridges? I mean, do you bomb his mother-in-law? Would that help? So it was a very tough time. It went on for some 77 days. I remember every one of them. And, you just didn't know if it was going to go on for 700 days. So people in those refugee camps had a tough time. There was no hot food or anything. And Catholic Relief from Baltimore was there. So great to be here. I must say I've been to Baltimore many times, but I usually go not here but over to Camden Yards because this is the only place I can afford Boston Red Sox tickets. And I felt very ashamed last time I was there because I was rooting for the Red Sox and all these Baltimore fans around me. But then I think it was Jay Payton hit a grand slam home run, and Baltimore won. So I sheepishly put aside my Red Sox hat and slinked out of the place. But anyway, so I'm today in Baltimore, and I'm pleased about that because it means I'm not in Beijing and I'm not talking to the North Koreans today. We have a director of the Korea desk from the State Department who's in North Korea today in Pyongyang and dealing with the North Koreans on some elements that I'll update you on. And his name is Sung Kim, Korean American, and he got on the phone this morning. It was about 9 o'clock my time, about 10 o'clock in the evening his time, and he said, God, this is tough. I hate this. I said, Sung, this is no time to talk about how much we hate our job. We all know we hate our job. How are you doing? So indeed, the issue of dealing with nuclear weapons and getting North Korea to give up these weapons, it has been a tough issue, and it's tough because their aspirations for these weapons didn't just start last Tuesday and didn't just start with the current administration or even the last administration. The aspirations for a nuclear weapons program in North Korea goes back to the 1960s, and they have a pretty powerful nuclear weapons lobby that's very interested in pursuing this. They have a military that very much wants to pursue nuclear weapons. So, even countries that I think it's fair to say would be called a dictatorship, even such a country has politics. And so there are a lot of people in North Korea who think this is the smart thing for North Korea to do. And for a long time, they pretended that this weapons program was really a nuclear energy program. The only trouble was this 5-megawatt reactor that they're working on in Yongpyeon Yongbyon. Yongpyeon is a ski resort in South Korea. Yongbyon is a nuclear reactor in North Korea. But for a long time, you know, this thing, it's never produced electricity outside the little village of Yongbyon. And it was very clear that what they really had in mind was a nuclear weapons program. And indeed, in the 1990s, this became increasingly obvious. Now, the U.S. tried to address this problem bilaterally. I mean, and we had some very skilled negotiators who dealt with this. People like Bob Gallucci, people like Bill Perry. And I think it's very important as a negotiator, and that's what I'm doing, is not to criticize the people who came before you. And it's not just the idea that, gee, a few years from now, I don't want someone up here criticizing me. It's really, you have to avoid using sort of presentism to talk about, you know, how people 10 years ago were dealing with the problem. You have to really put yourself in their shoes and understand what the problem was and how they're dealing with it. But I would say the flaw in how we were able to pursue this in the past was that we didn't really have partners in the process. We had countries that were quite willing to sort of stand on the sidelines and encourage us to keep talking to the North Koreans, but we didn't have countries that understood that this is not just an American problem. This is a problem belonging to many countries, especially the countries in the region. So in 2003, the United States, with President Bush, agreed with the Chinese, with President Jiang Zemin, to form what is called the six-party process. 6 parties refers to 6 countries. That is the U.S. and China, with China as the chair of this process, would work together with Japan, South Korea, with Russia, because if you look at a map, Russia is right there, and North Korea to try to address this problem. So we have a 6-party process. You know, a lot of people who work on diplomacy know the frustrations of multilateral diplomacy, the fact that you're often, it seems, sort of herding cats. Everyone is sort of going in a different direction. And indeed, this morning, we were trying to work out a next meeting, and everyone seemed to be everywhere else on the day we wanted the meeting. But once you are able to get 6 countries to do something, I think it's a very powerful thing. And so what we have tried to do with the North Koreans is get them to agree to certain things, not just with the U.S., but with these other countries. And in so doing, I think we've been able to move the process. We've been able to essentially surround North Korea by some of their very important neighbors, and these important neighbors have been able to move them along. So the first issue we had to deal with in the 6-party process was really the fact that the North Koreans had restarted their reactor in the early spring of, I think, in February 2003, and were actually producing plutonium. And this plutonium, which comes from the spent fuel rods of the reactor that go into something called a reprocessing facility, where they make plutonium and eventually turn it into metallized plutonium. This is the actual bomb-making material. So the first issue was and we did this in the summer of '05, was to get the North Koreans to understand that what is the purpose of this 6-party process? The purpose of the 6-party process is to create a nuclear-free Korean peninsula. And so the North Koreans wanted to say, well, the purpose of this is to have better relations among states, and we do want better relations among states. We do want a situation where we are all able to live and work together, but we're not going to be able to do that unless North Korea agrees to give up their nuclear aspirations. So they agreed to that, and so it was a framework agreement, a sort of statement of principles. We reached it in September '05. A lot of sleepless nights, a lot of very difficult process, but in September '05, North Korea agreed to give up its nuclear programs and nuclear weapons and to rejoin the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So that was important because we've always been able to come back to that. We've always, as we've gone ahead on implementing the issue, we've always been able to come back to the point that they have agreed to give up all their nuclear programs and all their nuclear weapons. The problem we have had with the North Koreans is they have argued that, yes, we've agreed to do it, but we didn't agree to do it when. That is, we didn't agree, when this would all happen. And also, there is going to be compensating measures to help North Korea's very challenged economy. That's about as diplomatic a word I can come up with for North Korea's economy. So what we've tried to do is on a step-by-step process with the understanding that we would all like to do this all in one grand slam and get it all done, and then we'd move on to the next problem. But instead, it's very clear North Korea was not willing to give up all their nuclear programs and nuclear weapons in one fell swoop. So we have been moving them on a step-by-step process. And I'm pleased that we've made some progress on it, which is not to say that we're there, not to say that the problem is resolved, but it is to say that we have made progress over the years using this six-party process. The first thing we needed to do, and this was after some fits and starts, but the first things we needed to do was to get them to shut off the reactor. Now, a lot of people say, well, isn't that what they did in the 1990s? They got them to shut it off, and they were able to turn it back on, and so why is that a big accomplishment? The fact of the matter is, if you want to disable the facility, that is, break it, make it difficult to bring back on, you really have to shut it off first. Now, anyone who's ever repaired a toaster knows that you don't just start repairing the toaster, you unplug it. And so this was the first thing. So we took a lot of criticism. And not everyone observes the rule that I do, which is not to criticize your predecessors or your future or your successors. So there were various people and various editorial pages saying, what are they doing? They're somehow giving in to the North Koreans, giving them more stature than they deserve. What we were doing was very much staying on task. That is, let's get the thing shut down so it's not producing plutonium. So we did that. It took a lot longer than we thought, but we did it as of July 15th. They shut it down. The second thing we moved into very quickly was to come up with a list of disabling steps. That is, steps that would act to make it difficult to bring the thing back online. When they turned it off in the 1990s, by the time the whole thing fell apart, the North Koreans were able to kick out the international inspectors, and within a couple of months they were able to turn it back on and have it start producing plutonium. We don't want that situation. We want it to be turned off and to stay off. So we agreed on a list of measures. For example, there's something called a reverse cooling loop, which is about the width of this room. And so we sawed it off on the end there and sawed it off on the other end and dropped it down to the ground, and that's where it sits. We did that I think it was the end of October in '07. And we're in June now, and there's grass that's grown up around it. There's a lot of rust in the thing. And so if they're ever going to put the reverse cooling loop up, first of all, they're going to have to buy a forklift because they don't have one. Secondly, they're going to have to replace a lot of the metal there because it's rusted away over the course of the winter. In short, it's not going to be easy to bring back. So we've succeeded in doing that. There are more steps we'd like to take. Indeed, we would like this, what we're calling this disablement phase, to go on to to a dismantlement phase, where you take critical components out of the whole structure and you send them out of the country. So in addition to having the problem of how to get the reverse cooling loop back up into place, they would have to have the problem of going to some internet site and ordering stuff that they don't have in the country. So we'll continue to work on that. But I think we have really made some real progress because it's shut down and it's disabled. Now, the second element that we need from them, and this has been a very, very tough process, but I'm pleased to say that we have made some progress on it, which is they have to give us a full accounting of what all their nuclear programs are for the purpose of taking this full thing and then figuring out how we're going to get rid of all these nuclear programs. So The first thing we've been concerned about, there are three main elements that we're concerned about. One was the fact that we knew in the early, in 2001, 2002, we found that they were making some purchases of equipment that was designed to, the equipment was to create centrifuges to make nuclear, make highly enriched uranium, which is the other way to make a bomb. There are two ways. One is through a reactor and plutonium. The other is through centrifuges and highly enriched uranium. Indeed, that's what Iran has been up to. So we knew that in 2001, 2002, and in fact, if you look at the reason why the whole agreement in the 1990s broke down, it was over the fact that we found out that North Korea was engaged in this kind of stuff. So we needed to know what they've been up to, and we needed to make very clear that they can't be engaged in it now, nor can they be engaged in the future. Well, those two latter points we were able to get fairly quickly. The North Koreans said, we're not doing it now, and we won't do it in the future. But the problem has been to get them to address what they did in the past. And so you would say, okay, it's good that you're not doing it now. It's good that you say you won't do it in the future. What about in the past? And then they come back at you, we're not doing it now, and we won't do it in the future. So what we've had to do is to work with them on this and make it very clear that at the end of the day, we do need transparency, we do need clarity on this issue. We cannot have a situation where we move forward and then we find that they've got some active program going. So that has been one issue that's been tough to resolve, but I think we have a way forward on that. The second issue was that, lo and behold, we found that North Korea had been engaged in some nuclear cooperation abroad, namely with a country, with Syria. And so, again, the North Koreans said, we do not currently have any nuclear cooperation with any country abroad, including Syria, and we won't in the future, or to put it another way, and we won't do it again. So the problem was what happened in the past. So again, we've had to kind of lay out to them what we've known. We've had to make very clear that if they don't want to explicitly deal with this, they need to understand what we know, and they need to understand that it is simply unacceptable to go forward with them if they have some nuclear cooperation with another country. I think we have an understanding on that, and that brings us to the third issue, which is we need to know how much of this plutonium they produced. Well, they had what are called several campaigns. That is, they produced some plutonium in the early 90s. They produced some plutonium in 2003. They produced some plutonium in 2005. And it's since been shut down, although there are some so-called spent fuel rods which could be used for additional plutonium. We have to have a very clear idea of how much plutonium there is. So we've worked very hard with them on this issue to find out how much plutonium. We've had considerable in-depth discussions with them on this. And what's most important is to get a sense of how much, or get a clear idea of how much they have and whether we have the means to verify that. Now, the first thing we wanted was documentary records of what they've been doing in the reactor. That is, if you run the reactor for a certain amount of time at a certain speed, there's a certain amount of spent fuel that should accumulate, and you should be able to figure out how much plutonium. So we need the production records, just as any auditor would look at a business and say, give us the cash book, et cetera. So the North Koreans agreed to do that, and they gave to us some 18,000 pages of documents. And you may have seen some people carrying that stuff over the demilitarized zone in seven cartons, 2 for the reprocessing facility and 5 for the actual reactor. And so we've been going through that for the purpose of determining, or helping to determine, do we have the means to verify that the declaration they give us is complete and correct? Because we can't have a situation where they give us X amount of plutonium and we find out later the real amount of plutonium is X plus Y. we need to know with great precision. So we have gotten them to give us that and to give us the figure. And we've gotten a means to verify that. Now, obviously, we have to keep working on the details, but we've got, I think, a process to deal with this. Now, a lot of people say, well, you know, why have the North Koreans suddenly agreed to do this? And the answer is that, as in most transactions, whether you buy a car or buy a bag of potatoes, you're going to have to pay for that. And so we have figured out a cost what we felt was acceptable. And so in order to get them, first of all, to shut off that reactor back in July '07, they agreed to take 50,000 tons of this heavy fuel oil. If you've been in the Navy, you know what it looks like, this very thick black stuff. Why heavy fuel oil? Well, they need it in some of their factories, and we know that they don't have the facilities to turn it into diesel or anything, so it can't be used in their tanks or any sort of military vehicles, et cetera. So we agreed on 50,000 tons of fuel oil just to shut off the reactor. Now, since the shutting off the reactor is easily reversible, as we know from 2002 to 2003, we then were prepared to give them a lot of other fuel oil, totaling 950,000 tons for these disabling actions, for a total of 1 million. Now, people say, well, gee, that's a lot, but compared to what we were doing in the 1990s, first of all, it's not just the U.S., because now we've got a process with other countries. We are taking turns providing fuel oil shipments. We're taking turns with Russia, taking turns with South Korea, and with China. The 4 countries are contributing fuel oil to this, to getting the North Koreans to denuclearize. Why is it only 4 countries and not 5? Japan has a special issue with North Korea that I'll go into in a bit, and the Japanese have made very clear that until they get progress on that issue, they are not going to participate in this consortium. But 4 countries is better than 1 country, and so I think it's a good deal, and I think it's a reasonable deal that we go forward with this. Now, unlike in the 1990s, where we were giving them a certain amount of fuel oil every month just to keep the reactor shut down, in this case, what we're doing is we've given them a finite amount of fuel oil, and if they want more fuel oil, they're going to have to do more denuclearization. So as we now move from what I hope will be moving from disablement of their reactor to dismantlement, where we not only take things apart and try to break them as much as we can, we take them out of the country. So we'll probably have to give them more fuel oil. I think it's worth doing, and I think it's affordable, especially since we're doing it with other countries. So we've now come to, I think, a very important juncture. Here we are in June. We are hopeful that soon, and we've worked out some details on what it means to be soon, we will have a situation where the North Korea will give us the declaration, and finally, the U.S. will, in particular, we will take some steps. That is, we have agreed to take some political steps. For example, one of them is we have agreed to remove North Korea from the so-called Trading with the Enemy Act. Now, Trading with the Enemy Act, for you history buffs, you'll know that that was first passed in 1862. It was primarily to deal with Marylanders who were trading with Virginians. Still has the same old title, Trading with the Enemy. And the North Koreans have objected to the idea that they should be covered by an act that uses the word enemy. So we are prepared, upon the receipt of a declaration of all their nuclear programs, we're prepared to remove them from application of this. So if we are able to do this, and this is not the only action, we have some other things we're going to do as well, we would hope to get to the point where North Korea will be on one side of the table, and they will have a certain amount of plutonium, whether it's 30, 40, 50 kilos of actual separated plutonium that they've produced from the reactor. We will have a pretty clear understanding that of what they've got in terms of uranium enrichment. and whether they've produced any at all, and certainly their commitment not to produce it now. We will have a six-party monitoring mechanism to make sure that these things are lived up to and that we share information with our partners. And so we will sit across the table and we will say, okay, North Koreans, how much, what is the transaction here to finish this job? What are we going to do to actually finish the process of denuclearization? We will put on the table several things. One of the things we'll put on the table is the idea that we will establish diplomatic relations with North Korea. We have no embassy there. We don't recognize North Korea. So we'd be prepared to recognize North Korea as one of the actions. We would be prepared to begin a negotiation with North Korea to replace the armistice on the Korean Peninsula, the armistice of 1953, which is sort of an elaborate ceasefire. We'd be prepared to change that armistice to a peace mechanism, a peace treaty of some kind. We would be prepared to work with the North Koreans on getting them access to international economic organizations and to address some of their economic problems. And finally, we are prepared, and I think we will work very hard on this, to maybe take the six-party process that we've established, which has gotten us some movement on the North Korean issue, and make it a more permanent fixture on the landscape of Northeast Asia. That is, we have found that as we have dealt with this North Korean issue, we found that countries, for example, Japan and China, that a couple of years ago were having some pretty tough times together, that Japan and China were actually able to work together in the six-party process. And we found that it was actually a very useful forum for relations among states. Now, for people familiar with Europe, they've got these forums everywhere. I mean, in Europe, you have people arriving in motorcades as other motorcades are leaving. The places like Brussels, they're all over the place. But in Northeast Asia, very little of this kind of multilateral format. And so we were finding that actually this six-party process was yielding some unexpected dividends in terms of countries being able to work together that were otherwise having a difficult time bilaterally. So we would like to see if we can take the six-party process and make it a more permanent element of the Northeast Asia security and security architecture. So we will see if the North Koreans are prepared to do this. I think certainly China, which plays such a key role because they are the dominant player with respect to North Korea, they have a great interest in the success of this. They want to see that the six-party process that they have been the chair of is able to succeed in the final process of denuclearizing North Korea. At first, I would say China was very skeptical of how the U.S. was handling it, but actually, the further we've gone, the closer the U.S. and China have gotten, and I think it is very valuable that the U.S. and China have been able to work together. We have a lot of dialogues with China. We are constantly talking with China about various things. This is one that we're not just talking together, we're actually working together. And so I think China would very much like to see if this can succeed, because China understands the value of having a closer relationship with the U.S., and they understand the value of seeing if we can address one of the toughest security problems, one of the most long-standing security problems, if we can work on it together. So I think we have found that as we have gone forward in the process, our relationship with China has improved. We've also found that, as I mentioned earlier, that Japan and China have been able to work together through this process. Indeed, Japan does have a very special issue with respect to North Korea, and that is that in the late 70s, early 80s, the North Koreans actually took several Japanese citizens and plucked them off of sidewalks and places near the seacoast in Japan and essentially kidnapped them. And so these kidnapped Japanese citizens, in a couple of cases, actually 5 cases, they actually reemerged some 20 years later when the North Korean leader, Kim Jong-il, in a meeting with the then Japanese Prime Minister Koizumi, gave these people over to the Japanese, and they were allowed to be repatriated. But there are many others, or at least certainly several others, who the North Koreans provided some explanation of their death, but it was a very cursory explanation. And I think it is quite understandable that their loved ones in Japan, and in particular the Japanese government as well, wants to know what happened to these people. And Japan has been, this is an issue not only for the Japanese government, but it's an issue for the Japanese people. They want to know what happened to people who were pulled off sidewalks and street corners and were put to work in North Korea, providing language training for North Korean intelligence agents and that sort of thing. So while the North Korean leader, Kim Jong-il, apologized to the Japanese Prime Minister about it in September '02, the Japanese have understandably wanted more information. And I think with Japan as a very important U.S. ally, one of the most important ally in the world, we want to make sure that the U.S. And Japan, that we stay very close together on this issue. For that reason, whenever I've talked to the North Koreans about what we are trying to do overall, I have stressed the fact that they need to come to terms with the Japan relationship. They need to work on ways to address that we cannot have a situation where we're all moving forward on the six-party talks and Japan's issue, which is so important to not only the Japanese government, but the Japanese people, is not being addressed. So we have worked very hard on that. We were pleased to see that North Korea and the Japanese had a meeting, the first time in a long time. They met last Friday. We're pleased to understand that there will be additional meetings, and we're hopeful that there can be actual progress on this. A lot of people ask, what about the issue of human rights? I mean, after all, when you look at human rights records around the world, and there are a lot of bad ones around the world, I'm sorry to say, North Korea has a record that, frankly, competes with some of the worst. So what are we doing about the human rights issue? And I would say it's a tough issue, but tough issues doesn't mean that we can't be raising that. And of course, I have raised the human rights issue with North Korea, and I've raised the fact that as North Korea goes forward, and if in giving up their nuclear ambitions, they are truly interested in joining the international community in a way that they've never done before, they need to understand that the price of admission, or at least part of the price of admission, needs to be to deal with their human rights record. Now, every country in the world, including our own, can do more in human rights. But I would say certain countries have further to go than other countries, and I would put North Korea in that category. And so the time for them to start improving their human rights record is now. And so I hope they will come to understand that human rights is not some additional weapon that we're using to poke and torment them, but rather an expression of not only our values, but the values of the international community. And I think as I've talked to them, I think they understand that. Whether they are prepared really to deal with human rights, I think time will tell. But ultimately, they need to understand that this is what the international community will expect, that they will open their record, their human rights record, to scrutiny, and will begin to deal with that, because it is not just coming from the U.S., it's coming from all civilized countries in the world. So as we go forward, one of the fundamental questions was, what will happen on the Korean Peninsula? I mean, will North Korea ultimately survive? And I would argue that's kind of up to the North Koreans to determine. North Korea does not face, as they've tried to suggest to me, they do not face any danger from nuclear weapons. The only dangerous nuclear weapons North Korea faces are the ones they've developed themselves. They need to understand that as long as they have these nuclear aspirations, they're going to really face an international community that I think is increasingly galvanized and increasingly unified on the issue that they need to get rid of these weapons, and that getting rid of them will be a path to a better future. I've often told them, almost to their consternation, that if you get rid of your nuclear weapons, everything will be possible. If you don't get rid of your nuclear weapons, nothing will be possible. So time will tell whether they are prepared to do that. I like to think that our efforts to work together with neighbors, our efforts to use diplomacy to convince countries like China, who may have had some doubts about putting pressure on North Korea, that we've been able to work together on this issue. I like to think that diplomacy is an art that can help get us what we need. And I like to think that ultimately, as we move forward, we have brought many countries that, such as China and Japan and China and South Korea, closer together than they would have expected. So I think we all can thank North Korea for that experience. Whether we get there is hard to tell. You know, people always say, "Are you optimistic?" And I always point out that I don't bet on ball games that I'm playing in, so we'll have to see how we do on that. But I do believe we got the right process, we've got the right format, and let's see if we get there. So thank you.
Thank you very, very much. The ambassador will entertain questions.
The question is concerning arms shipments to Taiwan, and question is suggesting the State Department has put a hold on this, and the question is whether this is related to the six-party process. First of all, the State Department has not put any hold on arms shipments to Taiwan. Arms to Taiwan are envisioned in the Taiwan Relations Act. So this administration and every administration has a responsibility to uphold the Taiwan Relations Act. To the extent, I mean, arms shipments are always carefully evaluated. I can assure you that they do not relate to the six-party process. They relate to how the U.S. government evaluates arms sales to Taiwan in terms of how they conform to the Taiwan Relations Act, in particular how they deal with the question of stability on cross straits. But I can assure you they're not related to some external, some additional factor. And I'm not sure where you heard the State Department has put a hold on it. I understand why everyone blames the State Department for everything, but this is one that I don't think we can.
Right, this may be an error of fact. What has been reported was that there's been a hold up on congressional notifications for every large military shipment to Taiwan, and obviously if you don't know about it,
I am not aware that there's, quote, been a holdup on every arms shipment to Taiwan. I know that arms shipments are evaluated from the point of view of, you know, the law, and from the point of view of whether and stability on the
They got to be true.
yeah. Question is about the process of unification on the Korean Peninsula. There seemed to be some momentum some 7 years ago. That momentum doesn't seem to be there today. What would be the attitude of other countries? For example, are there countries that don't support unification? So I would say the first thing that Americans should really stop to think about is the fact that the Korean Peninsula was divided in the middle of the 20th century through no fault of the Korean people. Now, I would argue it's through no fault of ours either. I mean, the U.S., we had Russia entering the war. We had the Red Army moving very swiftly down through Manchuria into the Korean Peninsula. So it was an effort by the U.S. to make sure that Russia did not end up, you know, with forces right down on Pusan. And so the U.S. Worked out an arrangement with Russia where we would take the surrender of Japanese forces on the 38th parallel, below the 38th parallel, and the Russians would take their surrender north of the 38th parallel. In fact, we had to fly in forces in order to take the surrender of the Japanese forces. So it wasn't like the U.S. was trying to divide Korea. But, you know, if you talk to many Koreans today, the issue of the division of the Korean Peninsula is a very, very painful subject. And for many Koreans, they look at that division and they see that it was not their fault, that it was somehow done by countries outside. And so it's a very sensitive issue. And I think from our point of view, we need to be careful that we don't appear to be sort of kibitzing or telling the Koreans how to handle North Korea. Obviously, we have a stake in it. We have a particular stake in it because we have troops there. And, you know, the security situation in the Korean Peninsula is very important to us. We have a treaty. We are a treaty ally of Korea, but so we have a great interest in it, but I think we need to be sensitive also to how Koreans regard this. And so, to be sure, there have been, Korean people have a real interest in trying to reduce tensions and somehow create a situation where at some point Korea could be unified. And I think it's been important for our country to take a positive view on that. But I think in taking a positive view, I think no one can overlook the difficulties of taking two systems that are extremely different. And you know, South Korea is one of the world's great democracies. I mean, they have really, in the last 20 years, with the Olympics as a sort of catalyst for this, South Korea is a country with you know, multiple institutions, with separations of power, with successful elections. They're a serious democracy, very serious democracy, and I would not put North Korea in that category. So these, how they would eventually result in unification is, you know, it's not an easy path, and I think what you're seeing really is that a lot of Koreans are asking the question, look, we like sunshine, we like, you know, everyone likes sunshine, except when it's 100 degrees, I guess, but you know, I think a lot of Koreans have asked the question, how is this really working, what does this mean, and I think that was part of what happened in the Korean elections in December, when the candidate who was in favor of continuing this was not elected. So I think Koreans are kind of working out their attitude to that. I think it's important for the countries around Korea to be supportive of what the Koreans are able to come up with, and to be respectful that this is a great tragedy that happened in Korea. You know, so often you hear Chinese talk about their century of shame and the fact that they're divided with the mainland and Taiwan. Well, this is a division right across the center of the country, right across the center of Korea. I mean, it's a terrible tragedy, and if you ever have an opportunity to go up to that DMZ and see what happened, it's awful. So I think it's something where the countries around need to understand, and I think most of them do understand, that Koreans are historically entitled to making their political arrangements on the Korean Peninsula, that they're historically entitled to unification, and that while we certainly have an interest in the security situation, it's ultimately going to be for the Koreans to work out. And I think the best way to make our influence felt is to have a good relationship with the Korean people and make them understand that we're not interested in dictating anything. We're interested in helping them overcome this terrible thing that happened to them. How are these six-party talks actually conducted? What's the sort of technology of this? Well, it's terrific. I mean, the way it works is you've got a room which is about this size if it went all the way around, and you have each delegation, each of the 6 delegations has a front table with about, I think we have 6 people on the front, and then about the delegations are about 25 or so behind. So you have a sort of this phalanx of delegations with 6, with a very large table, and then in the middle of it, you've got this display of sort of ferns, and then these large white tulips, which when I first started, I thought they were just kind of large white plastic tulips. But what I didn't understand, what I was soon to understand is you're sitting there with your script, you've got a microphone, and then in the way back of the room you have interpreters, because you've got a Russian, Korean, and by the way, there's no North Korean, South Korean, it's one Korean. So Russian, Korean, Japanese, English, and Chinese. So you have 5 interpreters. So what happens is you start to say something and all the tulips light up. And that means that you have to wait, because it's done on a consecutive basis, you have to wait till all the tulips go out, meaning that all the interpreters are done giving your sentence. So you can imagine, you get up there and say, it's great to be here in Beijing this warm summer day, and then all the tulips go up, and then you just kind of, and then you go to your second sentence. So when, people would tell me, you cannot meet the North Koreans in a separate room. You must only deal with them in the six-party meeting. Well, I'm sorry. I mean, you can't do any business when you're just looking at tulips all the time. So the way that works is you have your plenary session, tulip watching, and then you go on to a series of bilateral meetings. Now, when we kind of started this in the summer of '05, I kept track of how many bilateral meetings I had with each delegation, because some of the press was keeping track, and they wanted to make sure it wasn't just a cover for U.S. North Korea bilateral. So I remember telling the press I had 7 meetings with the North Koreans, and they were, very excited about that. But then I pointed out I had 8 with the South Koreans, I had 7 with the Japanese, and then someone would say, well, why did you have more with the South Koreans, Japanese? I don't know, I think we'll, and et cetera. But I had something like 63 meetings, bilateral meetings. And again, these multilateral things are tough, but overall, it's the right way to go, because when you finally get everyone in the right direction, and when you finally have, to mix the metaphor, have a sort of coalition of everybody, it's the way that we can move the process. So it's been the right way, even though we have to do these plenary and closing sessions with the tulips. So the question is, whether in the past year and a half, 2 years, there seems to be a change in North Korean attitudes, and whether this is real, and what would be the reason for it. Is that a good summary of it? It is very hard to say. I mean, if you look through history, the Korean Peninsula is one of the most, the Hermit Kingdom was the description of the Korean Peninsula. So it's historically, anthropologically even, a place that has been very closed. And so you have these 2 sort of examples now on the Korean Peninsula, this really go-go country called the Republic of Korea, South Korea. I mean, that is just, you go anywhere in Asia and you can see the effects of South Korea culturally, entertainment areas. South Korea is just all over the place. I'm sure if you looked out a window here, you'd see Samsung or Hyundai signs. South Korea is about as open and exciting a place, so that's quite ahistorical. But then you look at North Korea, and it is utterly, really closed up in ways that even the Hermit Kingdom was not. So you have these kind of 2 extremes coming from the same Korean Peninsula. So I like to think, and it's very hard to figure out what, how the North Koreans view this, but certainly there's got to be a concern in North Korea if they open up too quickly, they lose control of the situation, and maybe they lose control of the country. So they're obviously thinking in those terms, but on the other hand, I think they understand that they cannot, in an information age, in a technology age, they can't stay hermetically sealed. So I think there is some interest in trying to open up. I think they have used the U.S. as the sort of, they've used the notion that the U.S. is sort of somehow out to get them as the means to kind of keep control there. And I like to think that we're kind of disarming them of that and disabusing them of that. And I think the New York Philharmonic was part of that process. That was just extraordinary to see that America's best there, and see the North Korean reaction to it. So I think North Korea kind of understands they've got to do something different. But what they have used to kind of keep control, they would have to let go of those things. This notion that the U.S. is their sworn enemy. I've told them, we're not a sworn enemy of anybody, but we just cannot allow nuclear weapons, and we're going to keep at that. And we're not going to, we have a lot of options for dealing with it, but we don't have the option of walking away from it. So we're going to keep at that. But if they're willing to give that up, we're prepared to have a normal relationship with them, with the understanding we have a lot of problems with them, with human rights coming immediately to mind. So I don't know. I think they may have kind of come to the understanding that they have to change their ways, but I'm not of the view that they have made any dramatic strides in that regard. And if you go to Pyongyang, it's kind of disappointing in terms of you know, opening up. If you, as you mentioned, living in China, that is just amazing. I mean, it's for my lifetime, our lifetime, to see what has happened in China, it's just, you know, extraordinary and extraordinarily positive too. I think Americans who go there are kind of struck by what's happened in China. Well, you don't see that in North Korea, and unfortunately, you don't see it really on the horizon either. So, is there any cooperation between North Korea and Iran? And we are not in a position to confirm any nuclear cooperation with Iran. We are not. North Korea does have cooperation with Iran on missile technology, which is something we have to be very concerned about. North Korea has a capability of making some missiles. They try to export those missiles. They've been doing it with a number of countries, including Syria, but also Iran. So we have to track that stuff very carefully, because once you're into that kind of military equipment, you really need to look at it very carefully. The question is, do I think that military sales to places like Iran have been pushed aside as we've tried to make progress on the nuclear agreement? You know, I think there's a certain amount of triage here where you know, there are a lot of problems, and these missiles are a big problem, especially if you're in Japan. So the question is, you know, what do you deal with first? And so we've gone at the nuclear issue because I think that's the most dangerous issue. I think we have to go at them. I think we do have to deal with the missile issue at some point. I'm hopeful that as we set up a system for dealing with the nuclear issue, which has them turning these things over and then taking some benefits in return, that they will come to understand that these benefits are really what they should be looking for in the first place, and that the agents of isolation, such as the nuclear program and the missile program, are ones that they themselves should put aside in the hopes of achieving more economic benefits. For example, I think if they work to normalize relations with Japan, they would find that there would be much more economic benefits for them in a relationship with Japan than there are in selling missiles to a place like Iran. So it's not that we're ignoring them, pushing them to the side. It's simply that you know, you come into the situation, you see all these problems, and you try to take the most serious one first. I think any doctor can tell you about that. So.
I hate to be responsible for calling an end to the evening. This has been hugely informative, deeply authoritative, and very enjoyable. We're grateful for the evening, and we thank you for sharing your time
Thank
with
you
us.
very much.